Kurono, a reasonably high-end but also quite niche Japanese watchmaker, has decided to ban men from getting an allocation in their latest Seiji model. Kurono makes some rather lovely watches. However, it appears this decision is rather curious, and I'm going to go through why it is not a well-thought-out decision and why it's the decision that should not be followed by other manufacturers. Now, if you have any thoughts about it, however, do let me know that in the comments below. And if you're interested in buying some luxury watches, I've got some listed for sale on my website, luxuryprofessor.com, which I'll link to in the description below. You might find some of them interesting, or not, but check them out anyway. Now, with that out of the way, let's have a look at what Kurono is deciding to do. So we can first talk rather briefly about the watch itself. Now, there are two things that are interesting about the allocation. One is in relation to the restriction on women, and then two is in relation to the restrictions on flippers, which is a topic in and of itself, and those two are separable. So focusing first on the watch, it says, the new Kurono Seiji is limited to 388 pieces, in a Caledon-like blue-green lacquer dial finish, in Kurono's iconic 37mm case. While it can be worn by any gender, the Kurono Seiji is a conscious effort to increase the diversity of Kurono collectors through a unique distribution process. 70% of all allocations will be reserved for existing customers through an auditable, fair ballot system. Today, less than 5% of Kurono customers are women, but throughout history, they've always played a central role in the stability, progress, and long-term development of nations. In the developed world, they are 46% of the workforce, 42% of all professionals, and hold a quarter of all board seats worldwide. And in many cases, if not all, unless one has a death wish, they implicitly hold absolute authority in most families, relationships, and technically, the purse strings. That I would dispute because no one is going to hold absolute authority over me, but that's another question. Then it says, the new Kurono Seiji represents only the second time we're launching a solid lacquer dial watch. Seiji is finished in a Caledon-like bluish-green finish, a color that wasn't chosen from color swatches, but literally mixed by hand by a master watchmaker. Now let's talk about the allocation, which is the core of this video. The allocation it says here is, all nominees and applicants must identify as female. Male nominees will be denied. They also have some measures to prevent speculation and resale of the Seiji watch. So effectively, we've got two core things we would need to discuss, but I'm going to be focusing on this first one right here. All nominees must identify as female. There are some interesting measures to prevent flipping. Those measures would likely also not hold up in most countries, because they effectively void someone's warranty if they sell it within 6 months of the purchase, which is likely, in all likelihood, to violate consumer law in many countries. That, however, is a topic in and of itself. So the question then is this allocation decision wise or is it stupid? And to my mind, it is really badly thought out and is not a practice to be encouraged. The first major reason is discrimination against anyone on the basis of gender identity, sexuality, or whatever the case might be is A, illegal in most cases, and also B, fundamentally repugnant. The idea that one would discriminate against someone based on their gender identity is inherently problematic and should be prevented. It's not something that one would encourage. While they appear to be wrapping this in a veneer of diversity, it quite clearly isn't. Women have never been restricted from buying watches from either dealers or in the secondary market. There is simply no restriction on people going out and buying things in other dealers. So other watchmakers are perfectly happy to sell to anyone that will give them their money. In the secondary market, it's even more the case that people will just sell to whoever is buying. There is no restriction. Kurono here is manufacturing a supposed restriction. It comes across as confected and hollow and not in any way grounded in reality. Rather, it is either come across as either A, virtue signaling, or B, a marketing gimmick, or possibly both. Regardless, it is not grounded in reality, and it's confecting this idea that there was discrimination in sales, when in fact, there wasn't. So that's the first thing. Now, it could easily be that women might be underrepresented in the watch collecting community. There may not be. I don't want to stereotype anyone. But people are free to choose into or choose out of buying a watch. If women have statistically chosen out of buying watches, then that's a free choice that people can make. It's freedom of choice to go out and buy a watch. It's no one's forcing you to not buy one or to buy one. Kurono was effectively manufactured discrimination that they are supposedly trying to solve, but it comes across as confected because it isn't grounded in the real-life sales processes of what people are doing when they are selling watches. That's the first major issue. The second major issue that's closely related is it is illegal in the overwhelming majority of countries. It might not be illegal where Kurono is selling, but it is absolutely illegal in Australia. Let me show you where. So to see why this move would be illegal, we need to look at the Sex Discrimination Act in Australia, and we can see analogues across other countries, but I'll just go over one for the sake of argument. Now, each different jurisdiction will have a different piece of legislation. However, this will give you an example of the type of reason for why it would be illegal. Now, clearly no one's going to get damages by suing for this type of discrimination. A watch collector suing for not being able to buy a watch is not going to result in damages in general terms. However, the regulators would be able to prevent that discrimination, i.e. there would be able to be an injunction to prevent that discrimination or future discrimination. If someone was sufficiently irritated by it, they might lodge a complaint with the relevant commissioner, and this commissioner could then prevent any future discrimination. And if they were to fail to prevent that future discrimination, that is, if the company would continue going on with it, then that company could be subject to penalties. It is very unlikely an individual will get much damages, but penalties could potentially be imposed. So let's have a look at the legislation and see what would happen here. So in general terms, we've got various different prohibitions on discrimination. So we've got some preliminary matters here, and these preliminary matters I won't really focus on right now. However, the first thing we'll want to go to is the general prohibition in relation to the provision of goods and services under section 22. So let's go through to that section and see exactly what it says. So we can see this in section 22. Section 22 says, "It is unlawful for a person who, whether for payment or not, provides goods or services or makes facilities available, to discriminate against another person on the grounds of that person's sex, etc., etc. By refusing to provide to that other person the goods or services or to make the facilities available, in the terms or conditions on which the goods or services or facilities are provided, in the manner in which those goods or facilities are provided." So prima facie right here, if you are preventing an individual from getting an allocation in a purchase for a watch by virtue of their gender identity, that is clear-cut violation of section 22 here. You are both A, discriminated against the person by preventing them from being able to get an allocation, and even if you think, well, that person could buy it in the secondary market, then you have substantially altered the terms and conditions and nature on which they can purchase that watch, because you are then forcing them to go and buy in a different market and not buy first hand. So automatically, it would violate section 22. That, to my mind, would not in any way be debatable. We can also see some other provisions that will come into play. So back at our table of contents, we can look at two potential exemptions to this. One exemption would be if the measure were to try to achieve substantive equality, and the second exemption would be if there was some other special circumstance. Now, I'll go with that latter one first, because that's going to be the quicker and easier one to address. That other one would maybe fall within one of these exemptions, such as services for members to one sex. The other general exemptions would not apply here. There are myriad exemptions that might apply, for example, to religious organizations or the like. There are also exemptions for services that would be intrinsically only provided to one sex. So, for example, particular types of, let's go hypothetically, say it's a gynecologist. That gynecologist will only provide particular services to people of one particular sex because of the tautological nature of what that person does as a job. So that could be a situation here. And they would only provide specific services to a person of one specific gender, as an example. However, section 32 here would not apply. So if we go to section 32, you'll see immediately why. So here we are on section 32, where it pertains to services to members of one sex, where it says, nothing in division 1 or 2 applies in relation to provision of services, the nature of which is such that they can only be provided to members of one sex. Selling a watch is not the nature of something that can only be provided to a member of one sex. Therefore, Section 32 is not in any way relevant or applicable in this situation. The other exemption pertains to Section 7D, where it says special measures intended to achieve equality. And it says, a person may take special measures for the purpose of achieving substantive equality between men and women. I want to emphasize here substantive equality, because substantive equality needs to be defined for this to even be relevant. We can't just say substantive equality in some random or vague way. We need to define exactly what that is. And what that would mean is, in a case of goods and services being provided, men and women having equal access to the ability to provide those goods. It does not mean 50% of your customers are men, 50% of your customers are women. It means they have equal access to go out and buy those goods. That's prima facie the case by virtue of the other provisions of this act. For example, the other provision states men and women should not be discriminated against when going out and buying goods and services. And if it were already the case that men and women could go out and buy things equally, you're not achieving any form of substantive equality by restricting the sales to one gender. So it would clearly not fall within the substantive equality provision, because there already was free access to buy these things, regardless of gender, and this would not in any way be rectifying a problem, because there was not a problem. The fact that you had not successfully sold to women in the past doesn't mean that there was a discrimination issue. It means maybe your sales and marketing was off. But that's the first thing here in Section 1, and all of the other ones here aren't really pertaining to the relevant situation here. It says here, a person does not discriminate against another person by virtue of taking these special substantive measures. And then continuing further down, it continues and it says, a measure is to be treated as being taken for the purpose of subsection 1 if it is taken solely for that purpose, or for that purpose as well as other purposes, whether or not that purpose was a dominant one. Then it says here, this section does not authorize the taking or further taking of special measures for a purpose referred to in subsection 1 that has been achieved. I.e., if there is already substantive equality, you can't go out and keep doing those measures if substantive equality exists. So that also needs to be borne in mind. So again, going back to that idea of substantive equality, if men and women could already buy and get allocations, then substantive equality doesn't even come into play. We can also see similar situations in education or employment. Substantive equality means people with similar qualifications have similar access to jobs, and there is not adverse discrimination against an individual when getting that job. However, it does not mean you get carte blanche to go out and impose quotas, because if your quota is not in any way tied to the merits for getting that job, in terms of your ability to perform the job, then it would not be achieving substantive equality. It would achieve numerative equality, but it does not say numerical equality here. It says substantive equality, i.e. equality on the merits of the individual, not numerical equality. Now that is a tangent here, but it is important to stress here. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the legislation. So the legislation would seemingly prohibit Kurono from engaging in these types of practices. That's important because it means that Kurono, if they were to engage in these practices, perhaps in Australia, for example, then A, it would be illegal, B, someone could complain to the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, and C, if they were to do that, while they would be unlikely to get damages, it would be a public embarrassment for Kurono. Also, there might be imposed penalties. Furthermore, there would be an injunction from them doing this type of discrimination in the future. So it overwhelmingly would be a negative outcome. The complainant in this case would not really be out of pocket because it would go to the commissioner, and it wouldn't really cost them very much to complain. So as such, they can complain to the commissioner pretty much for free, and Kurono then gets put into a position that is not particularly attractive to them. So the illegality factor should be enough in and of itself to give pause. Then you add on the fact that it's inherently repugnant to discriminate based on gender identity when selling goods or services. Add these two together, and this is really not a particularly smart or well thought out or high quality decision that Kurono is undertaking. So if we're seeing that it is prima facie a really stupid idea, because it's either A, morally repugnant to discriminate, and or B, it is prima facie illegal, we need to think about why is it that Kurono is doing this? And is it likely to convey any benefit? It's very likely that Kurono is doing this, primarily for marketing reasons. They've observed that they have relatively few female customers, and by virtue of having few female customers, they want to broaden their buyer base. Now, if Kurono has been a niche brand that's primarily appealed to collectors, they need to find a way to broaden that brand base. One way to do that is to get their existing customers to bring along their wife or girlfriend or mother or daughter or whoever into the watch brand so that they now get onto the sales and marketing database for Kurono. So Kurono can send out their emails to spruik their other random stuff. So effectively, Kurono now have access to another set of women who have now been brought on board to buy these watches. Furthermore, they're probably hoping that by virtue of needing to be referred by a significant other, these other buyers are more likely to be retail buyers who are not really watch collectors. The reason I say that is if the person were a watch collector, they could easily have gone out and bought Kurono beforehand. By virtue of the need to be referred, it means that they probably were less likely to be looking at this watch or less likely to be looking at watches in general. So they've now been referred on by another buyer, i.e. referred on, and therefore they're less likely to be like a buyer that would, in finance terms, be a sophisticated investor, i.e. someone who's really following it in minute detail and analyzing the specifics of each individual watch. They'd be more likely to be a retail investor, to use investment terms. Retail investors are easier to sell things to at a higher price. So to some extent, you can see why they might prefer to have retail buyers as opposed to hardcore collectors. So that could be another reason here, trying to broaden their sales and marketing database, but also specifically target retail investors or retail buyers by virtue of how they're doing the allocation through referrals, as opposed to going directly to collectors themselves. This then, by having them on their retail database, might also help to encourage that person, if they're a significant other, to then feedback marketing to the other partner. So you end up with like this circular loop. Furthermore, by virtue of someone personally referring another person, they now are implicitly under a feeling that they won't be able to say anything negative about Kurono, because then they will almost be shooting themselves in the foot about having to refer this watch beforehand. For example, say you've referred the Seiji to your partner, and then afterwards you go and trash Kurono, i.e. trash the brand that's made the Seiji, is going to make you look a little bit bad. So we're effectively trying to lock in a positive marketing loop here. So in reality, there's a whole lot of marketing reasons they're doing this. It builds up a bigger database of buyers that might be easier to sell to, and also a bubble surrounding the brand by effectively locking people into not saying anything negative about Kurono. That effectively appears to be what is going on here. Then they've wrapped it up in a veneer of diversity and equality rhetoric, notwithstanding the fact that this would be illegal in many markets. And it comes across as rather hollow and confected. For this reason, I think it is not a good marketing strategy. And it's definitely one that I would not encourage. And in other markets, it's definitely one that would be avoided for the obvious legal reasons. Nevertheless, those are my thoughts about Kurono's decision here. If you have any thoughts about it, do let me know that in the comments below. And otherwise, it would be great if you check out my website, luxuryprofessor.com, and it would be great to see you for future videos as well. Bye.